Hi, I'm Dr. David Dobson. Welcome to Conversations. Conversation is a show that features insightful discussions with scholars worldwide on a variety of academic topics. Today, my guests are Gina Johnson, Dr. Sidney Shapiro, and Donna West. Together, we will be discussing our podcasting journey. Thank you all for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's
Thanks.
begin by introducing ourselves and our podcast.
Oh, hi, David. My name is Gina, and I live in the Fraser Valley of British Columbia. And the name of my podcast is Life's Valleys and Mountaintops.
Thanks, David. My name is Sidney Shapiro. I'm an assistant professor of business analytics at the University of Lethbridge and an adjunct assistant professor of computer science. My podcast is AI in Action, and I talk to people about AI, what it means, how it's doing, in all different ways.
Hello, my name's Donna West. I'm from Perth in Western Australia, and with a friend of mine, Di, we host a podcast called the Double D's Discovery Diaries, so DOUBLEDS, and we interview people and share their stories of courage and resilience.
Could you share the story of how your podcast came to be?
So I had the dream in October 2023, and we launched our podcast in April 2024. So we've into our second season now and up to 23 episodes.
I did not have a dream. I filled out a funding application asking for money that was granted, and I promptly forgot about it, and that was it. And then maybe 6 months later, the research office sent me an email saying, "You promised you deliver a podcast. You need to spend this money, hire some students, and make it happen."
Okay.
So I decided that since everybody was talking about AI, and it was every time I went to a talk, somebody would say, "But the Terminators are coming to destroy the universe." And the other people would ask other questions. And I thought every person has such a different perspective on how it's impacting society. We would make a show about how AI is impacting that person and talk to people from all different walks of life. So it was really interesting to see people's stories. In our first season, we did 25 episodes, and we've already recorded 6 or 7 in season 2, and that should be launching sometime this summer. And it was really nice to have the support of the university and
Yeah.
SHRC, Social Sciences and Research Humanity Canada, in order to help us make the podcast and share people's stories.
I used to be a bus driver, and I was trying to get rich quick in 2014. And I was following a podcast group, and I was building this podcast, helping people to be healthy around my work schedule. And then next thing I knew, I was in the hospital for 5 days, and I had like this major health event. And so I stumbled upon a blog post. I think the guy's name's like James Altucher, and he said to think about like 10 things every day you could do. And so I came up with this idea of just trying to interview people that went through these life-changing challenges to kind of honestly benefit myself to figure out how did they do it.
Yeah.
And then once I figured it out, I started having people email me and say, "Wow, this is so inspiring. Here's what I want to hear." And so it just kind of continued for 5 more years. So I realized a podcast is not to, get rich quick, and that it's kind of just like a marketing tool. And I really loved it.
Yeah.
But when I started to do my degree, I found I didn't have time anymore. And so I actually posted my last podcast episode was to say I'm taking a 1-month break. And that was 6 years ago.
Like, what is your podcast style is?
Our podcast style is fairly informal. We have a conversation, so we don't really have set questions in advance.
Okay.
But what we do is we talk to and meet with the people beforehand, or the person, and we have some ideas about the types of things we would want to talk about and see what they talk about, and have a match and figure out the themes. And all of our podcasts so far, so all 23 episodes have been in person. So we're very fortunate. We've got we can use a fantastic podcasting studio at Curtin University in Perth. Always had people come in, and just lately we've done a couple of live audience podcasts, which we've also. That's the first time we've done video, so they're on YouTube now as well.
Nice.
I think especially our first ones were around 50 minutes.
Okay.
And so then with the extra, start ads and things, sponsorships a bit shorter. But we're now making it the later ones a bit shorter.
Okay.
So around the discussion will be 30 minutes.
Okay.
It depends upon the person and how. Sometimes people have got a lot to say in their story, so let them keep going.
Naturally, because it's an AI podcast, we let AI do all the heavy lifting. They just take care of everything. Although now I know that for my next upcoming vacation, I'm going to Curtin University to do a podcast episode in person in Australia, which I'm very excited about.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's going to be amazing. It's my best podcast trip ever. So what I do is I have the same process for each episode. I take the person's LinkedIn, then put it in ChatGPT, say, here's the format. Can you give me 6 guidepost questions on what we can talk about? I would say we only talk about those things probably 40% of the time. Something spontaneous happens and we talk about something else. The really interesting thing is that based on the person's bio, it may not actually be what they're interested or passionate about. And it goes in a completely different direction. So that's usually what happens. I always start off every episode talking to people about Skynet because that's why I started the podcast in the first place. And I find that most people either are really into it, they're really against it, or something. And I think in a lot of ways the conversations that come out of it is talking about what people think and how they approach this particular issue. Like, in other words, what are they bringing into it, and how does that change what they're thinking? So it's always very interesting talking to people. We've talked to people from ICU nurses to people who are research scientists, and dozens of people in between, and everybody has some very different take on how they're going to be impacted. We start with an hour session on Zoom. I started with Zoom, but we moved to Descript. And what we do is try to get through some of the guidepost questions if possible. And if not, we just chat for 30 to 60 minutes and then edit that down probably to like 20 or 30. That's usually it. At the beginning, I started doing monologues and I would like introduce the topic and talk about it. And we stopped doing that later on because it turns out the guests are more interesting than I am. So we went with that instead. And that's basically the genesis of how it turned into what it is now. Basically a type 30 that's edited that has a little bit of intro and extra outro at the beginning. And that's basically it.
Yeah, cool.
I unfortunately started my podcast before AI, so I would spend like 20 hours a week on my podcast. Oh my gosh, yeah. And in the beginning, it was like hour-long interviews. And then I got it scripted with questions I would send in advance. And I found the longer I did it, the kind of like higher credibility of people that I would have. And their time was really hard to get. So they only had 20 or 30 minutes to get the whole story in. So by the end, they were a lot shorter.
I want to ask you, who are your guests? In your case, Gina, who were your guests and how do you invite them to participate?
Well, that's a good question. In the very beginning, I was part of like a podcaster group. So I just interviewed people in my group. And then people started messaging me and they'd say, I have this cool story. Or I'd read a book and I would be like, oh, I'd love to talk to that person and just send them an invite. So kind of started with connections and then ended up being recommendations or people who just had really neat stories.
Okay.
So it just depends. It depends who I'm talking to and what we're talking about. But I'll give you the quick rundown from season 1. I talked to a professor, a data scientist, another data scientist, a voiceover actor who does comedy, a social work professor, a cybersecurity expert, a business leader, a professor of marketing, and more like that. That's basically the idea. So that's the first 10. And really, I think that, it impacts people in so many different ways. Usually what happens is I see somebody post on LinkedIn or somebody's talking about AI, and I'll write them and say, I'd really like to discuss this like in a longer format. Maybe you could share some of your ideas. And I would say most of the time it's interesting. The ones that I'm not sure about are when somebody's trying to pitch a product and that's all they're focused on and every answer comes back to their product. That's like less interesting for me because I really want to know what they think. And, having been a guest on some podcasts while I was going through this process of making them really made me appreciate, like Gina was saying, sending out the script in advance, finding their picture, sending a release, like all these different steps that happen that makes it a much easier experience, much like this podcast that you did all this advanced work and actually brought us here at the same time. So that's something that I'm building in. It's not just about the podcast itself, but also the process of how to get it going and put all those pieces together.
We've had guests. So we have guests with stories of courage and resilience, and so we've had a lot of different stories, and they're mostly that we either know or we meet. And met them, for example, one of our someone I met in a sauna one day, and I actually we've interviewed a few older people, and just recently this week, it hasn't come out yet, but we interviewed a 92-year-old that I met at a 90th birthday party, who was in the Holocaust, who was a survivor of the Holocaust. So that was quite amazing. So we just come across these people. We find that we never have to worry about who to interview because we know that someone will appear.
Yeah. Was it challenging to invite guests?
I can start with that because we found that there's a lot of people with really very interesting stories about courage and resilience, but they might not necessarily be ready to share those stories.
Yeah.
Probably 50% of the people we've asked have said no, they're not going to share their stories yet. Yeah. And other people that we speak to, they're ready. For example, we interviewed someone who was in the Boxing Day tsunami. A very, very incredible story of surviving that. Yeah. So he was ready to tell his story, and it was 20 years later, and it was the first time he'd publicly told his story. So everyone's at different times in their journey.
Yeah.
I can speak on that. For me, it was a little bit easier because I started in that podcast mastermind. So there was a lot of like, I'll be a guest on your show, and then you can be a guest on my show in the beginning. And then that got like the first 5 or 6 out. And then from there, it was a lot easier to just have people naturally kind of want to be a part of something like that.
Yeah.
I think people get defensive about, approaching them like they're an expert, and they're like, well, I don't know what to say. I don't know, how to phrase it. And I think now that we have 30 episodes that are on the internet, people could actually listen to the podcast, see what it's like, and then see what their responses would be, how it fit in. I usually share like a proposal message with them, explaining like what the podcast is, how I see it, and most importantly, there's no pressure. There's literally, you can talk about whatever you want. There's no guideposts. If you want to talk about something different, that's okay too. And I've met some amazing people through the podcast that I never really have talked, forget about AI, but just in general with. And it's been a really cool experience to find out, like, what are they thinking about it and how does it work? And sometimes the interesting part for me is not the AI part. It's actually their life story or, something else. And I think that has a lot of power too. So, it's really just the approach. And the more that I've been doing it, the more comfortable people are understanding what exactly they're getting into.
Yeah, our podcast. So as I said, we're very fortunate we can use the podcast studio at Curtin University for so we don't pay for that. But the only cost that we have is our time. Also, we have an editor that edits our podcast, and she's based in Malaysia. So she's fantastic, and that's our main cost.
I did everything myself, the editing and all the work. So I had no expense other than the software. But because I'm self-employed and have my own business, I just use that as a business expense and use it as like advertising. But at the end, I had people sending me like books and T-shirts and all kinds of stuff. So I felt like I was being paid. And then I had people that wanted to like offer money to be on the podcast. And so that like I took the ethical question to like my podcast group and was like, that doesn't feel right. I don't want to take money for the podcast. So I always had guests for free, and kind of same thing as Sidney was saying, when people were like using it for advertising, it was not as good. So I really preferred if people did it from the good of their heart and not for business reasons.
My podcast is supported by Shirk and the university, the Dillon School of Business and the University of Lethbridge. And the amazing thing is that we were able to hire a lot of students to work on it in many different areas, whether it's like editing or interviewing, approaching people. And my favorite episode was when one of my students interviewed me. And he was the host. And I think that, like working, like switching roles and thinking about what it's like to host a podcast is a really great experience for students that they can learn from, either that they love it or hate it, but at least they get to do it. And that's something that not everybody has the opportunity to do. So I thought it was really cool that we were able to build a lot of student jobs as part of the podcast, whether it was like editing or putting together the graphics or other things. And it's really, I think, made a very big impact, not just on the listeners, but just creating a podcast.
So how do you decide what topic to discuss on your podcast?
So a lot of times I'm interested in talking to people about how does AI impact them? And maybe we don't even agree on what AI means.
Yeah.
So I talk to university professors who are concerned about students cheating or losing their jobs or something else. I talk to students who are like, this is a totally different world from when they started their bachelor's and now they're in their master's, and like it can't exist without ChatGPT. And I've talked to like NICU nurses or professors who are talking about, machines giving out the wrong amount of information and having to have human oversight to ensure that there's very strict controls. And these are completely different use cases for this like similar kinds of technology. But really, I'm interested in finding about people's stories because we're all experiencing this roller coaster of now AI frenzy that's only started within the past few years, even though the whole field has been around for a very long time. Just it didn't capture the public imagination. So I feel like now's the time for people to share their stories and talk about how it impacts them and see, is this a good idea or not? And half my guests usually think it's a terrible idea.
I want to ask you, who are your intended audience who are most likely to be interested in your podcast content or your stories?
So I'll talk about your podcast, David, and the episode that we did. We'll plug a previous episode of putting together an episode of what to do when you attend a conference. And I thought that was so fantastic because those are things that nobody ever tells you. Just like how to write a paper or what actually matters to universities. And we live in these systems where there's tons of, courses and things to do, but actually the whole, hidden part, you have no idea, like how to get value. So I think those topics that really tell you things that I would have really appreciated had I heard 10 years ago, so I would know what to do or how to get published or those type of things are really valuable because there's so much hidden content that we don't get exposed to, right? I, like my podcast is more conversational, but it's basically the same idea. What are the things that people are thinking, but they're not really talking about on a regular basis, right? Especially when they're doing this for work.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, with our podcast, we've found that we had some of our previous guests come back and talk about the experience, and they one common theme was so. For example, we had a Venezuelan woman who was realized she was gay quite young, and she was very nervous about coming on the podcast because she thought firstly her English wasn't good enough, and secondly she would be judged. But in actual fact the opposite happened, and she had so much support and connection, and people said, oh wow, I loved your story because I now realize I'm not alone. So we find that the people that listen to the podcast, they either love hearing stories, personal stories, and also certain people are attracted to certain stories. So we also had another woman whose baby passed away after only 90 minutes. And so that really spoke to a lot of people who had also gone through miscarriages or tragic losses and things like that. So yeah, we find it our podcast has really been creating connections between people.
Mine was actually a huge surprise because my target audience was like a mom who just finished raising her family. Now she wants to start a career. So like, what does she have to do? But it ended up that the average listener was between the age of like 40 and 55. It was mostly military veterans, people rehabilitating from prison, and a ton of entrepreneurs that were looking to pivot into a meaningful career. So I learned it's because we had kind of figured out transitions. And so many people want to make transitions that there isn't really just like a target niche perhaps for that.
David, I was going to mention our most downloaded podcast by far was one that we did on how to stay mentally healthy. And we found that all of a sudden we had this huge number of downloads, and most of them were from the USA. And I thought, well, yeah, that's probably appealing to people. So the topic that a lot of.
Like, how do people access your podcast?
My podcast I have on every podcast site, and people find it on their phone. A lot of people I think connected through LinkedIn. The guests that I have on the show, they share it as well. And because we're already connected, it just adds additional people coming in. And some of them do have a lot of people listen to them through other means. And I think breaking out of that initial bubble of me and the guests and both of our combined networks is really the challenge of getting out there and scaling.
So I think that's probably one of our biggest challenges is spreading the audience, getting more, letting people know about the podcast. I mean, I have a weekly newsletter that I send out, and I always mention the latest podcast episode. So that's a good one. But yeah, and it's on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And generally, yeah, people you meet is talk about it and they want to start listening. So yeah, it's growing organically.
Yeah. So is mine.
Yeah, I did the same as everybody else. It was on all the usual kind of places, Spotify. There even used to be Google Podcasts at one time. I never did YouTube. I just did a podcast. And then I interviewed quite a few of like world-renowned authors. So I was very fortunate because they shared the link and then it got shared with all kinds of places. So it went to like Japan and United Kingdom and all over the place.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to ask you, what do you like being a podcaster?
So I was in class one day and my student said, your voice is so relaxing and just puts me to sleep. It would be great if you could just summarize this class in a podcast. I'm like, look, I'm already making slides. I'm already like filling things in the course. You also want me to make a podcast?
Yeah.
And I never really took it seriously until I applied for a grant, actually won, and then said, okay, now we have to be serious and put together a podcast that people want to listen to. And in my area, the only time I've ever had people who are this passionate about anything I've ever talked about is about AI. Like I go and talk about something really boring, like sorting images of cats and algorithms, and then somebody in the audience starts screaming about flying cars and the future and AI taking over. I figured this would be something that was really interesting and people wanted to talk to. So, I thought that from both the student perspective as well as for the listeners, it'd be interesting to hear other people's perspectives.
Yeah.
And that's a key part of how it all develops.
Yeah.
Definitely, without a doubt, like the people that we've met and the stories and we just so inspired by them ourselves. And then also we kind of see ourselves as a vehicle for people to share their stories and then they can impact positively on someone else's life. We've heard a lot of things about that, how a certain episode has really inspired or even helped this season, focusing on building our listeners' courage and resilience.
Yeah.
So we've had some experts come in and give some tools if you're struggling like that. So it's just helping make a difference, I guess. You don't know what's going to happen when you put the podcast out into the world.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so mine started because I'm a runner and I always like listening to podcasts. And I also was commuting for like 3 hours a day. And then after doing it for a while, a lot of the people I interviewed, I became really good colleagues with, and we're still connected on social media today. So I just really loved it. It was like building a whole entire community.
Yeah. And what are the challenges we face as a podcasters?
This could be a podcast by itself, but basically so many problems. I never did a podcast before. I had a radio show when I was in university and it was nothing like what I thought it was going to be doing a podcast. It's super time intensive. So, one of my colleagues said there is absolutely no way you're ever going to be able to produce a podcast. And the only podcasts I'd ever listen to are true crime podcasts. And it turns out nobody ever got murdered on the AI in Action podcast, which is probably a good thing. And, that whole idea of like listening to the news or This American Life, which really like inspired me, does not work when you're talking to people about AI. Like it's not going to be some kind of interesting, inspiring story. It's going to be people talking about ChatGPT, right? So you got to like make it work and still keep it interesting in a way that like actually comes together.
Yeah.
There were so many challenges between, I interviewed a really interesting guest and it didn't record properly and I had to go back and fix it and redo it. I had a guest in Australia that their audio didn't upload and it took 2 weeks to actually get the file. And, I think that there's so many technical challenges or things to learn to improve the process. That was really the biggest key problem. And again, I learned all this by not only doing my own podcast and suffering through it, but by being on other people's podcasts and learning from the experience of on their side, how they set it up. And I asked a lot of questions and I found that really useful. So I think the whole thing has been a learning journey for me and it's really helped me maybe do it more efficiently. I don't know if it's better, but I'm trying. And the many people that from editing, from putting things together, from scripting and using all these different pieces to try to make it something people want to listen to.
Yeah,
the challenges I think well at the beginning the challenge was putting yourself out there and listening to your voice and feeling all that sort of thing. So then when you start thinking not so much about you, it's about the audience and the guests. And you get more used to that over time. So that's good. I guess it's all that whole thing of building a community, and the promotion and the growing of the audience. That's why when we did our live podcast for our first anniversary, we did a live podcast, and there was about over 50 people in the audience. So that was great because you got that from the people and a lot of kind of community building for that. So that was really great. So so we're slowly getting there, but definitely the marketing and the audience, I think, is the most for sure.
Yeah, sure. I kind of took the same approach as you and Sydney and just learned as I went. But I remember in the first few I did, I got a phone call from someone in a different time zone. It was like 6 a.m. and they were like screaming at me. I had the phone and they're like, "Are you incompetent? There's like 500 spelling mistakes in the show notes."
Oh, God.
So I go and I look. I didn't know on WordPress there's no spell check. So I copy everything in WordPress and there was. It was so embarrassing.
Yeah.
And so I started using WordPress to type everything first. And then AI came along. You could, automate everything. I started using Calendly to kind of schedule things to make it easier. And then the other thing was legal liability. So some of the interviews I had, people shared things that could cause like legal issues. So I had to kind of learn and then start to make some boundaries and guidelines and edit things out.
Yeah.
Just one other thing on that. I think when you start a podcast, you're very focused on the technology and how you're going to do it and the technical equipment and things like that. But I really think the more important thing is the content and figuring out what's your audio, what's your message and what's your podcast about, and sort of thinking that through. And I think that's pretty important to do, which I think people get very focused on the technical stuff.
So I completely agree. When I did the first couple episodes of my podcast, a lot of people were listening to it, and I was wondering, are they listening to it because of me or because of the guest, or like why would they listen to it? Again, I've only listened to true crime podcasts, so I didn't really get the appeal. So I took my dissertation, which is like 400 pages, and in AI, I converted it into little stories about each chapter, and I made a 12-episode podcast called The Hidden Influencers, which is totally AI read, AI generated. I don't even know what's in there. I've never listened to it, and I didn't read the notes, but it's a podcast that 95 people have listened to, the 3-hour audiobook version of it doesn't read the thesis. It actually just makes up a story about each chapter. You could listen to it and tell me what you think, but it is kind of shocking to me that, so maybe like that small amount of listeners are washing dishes listening to this AI generated story about my thesis. I don't know. But the actual episodes, like, the real podcast does take off and people share it around and they're interested in it, and it does build dramatically. I think they're interested in the stories, I find it difficult to listen to my own podcast, so I can't really tell you from a listener perspective, but from a creator perspective, it's really a lot of fun, and it's a great way to talk to people about what they're interested in.
Yeah. How do you measure the success or impact of your podcast, or if you measure such thing?
I don't know if we all have different answers about this, but my answer is that, at the beginning, I was very focused on metrics, and every viewer is another amazing thing that happened. And really, it comes down to the quality and who's interested in what. And I really stopped looking at the metrics altogether and tried to figure out, how do I deliver value to the people listening that they actually enjoy it, like that they want to tune in and listen to the next episode. And that's been a little bit of playing around, and maybe things that I'm interested in. Maybe it's not going to be a famous person, but instead a student that wants to present their graduate research before they graduate and talk in a easy, accessible format, and they can talk about their thesis in AI. Or somebody who's facing a dilemma in business or ethics or something else of how AI impacts them on a regular basis. And I find those stories are really interesting and similar to what everybody else is dealing with as well. I find that my podcast is not going to be like evergreen. It's about a topic that's going to be different next week. And, at the time it comes out, people listen to it. And I think it's just producing content that I would want to listen to helps grow it, and people share it around. So I really think it just comes to organic growth and not really focusing so much on the numbers rather than on the story.
Yeah, for sure.
I think we do look at the metrics and things like that, but I think the success is, when you get back story. Well, firstly, the guests and their experiences, and if as I mentioned before, the person that was in the tsunami, that was the first time he'd shared his 20 years.
Yeah.
So and then when it's positively impacted on someone, and it's really helped them with something they're struggling with, or just to feel like they're not alone. I think that's what we do the podcast. So
yeah.
Because when I started, they didn't have all the rules about analytics yet, so you could see everything like age, location,
Oh, really?
And so it was really interesting. I really was very into tracking like what country was listening.
Yeah.
And then when I got to like about 10,000 listeners, other people were at like 1 million because I was in this big group. And I was like, oh, this is so frustrating. I'm not growing as fast as everybody else.
Yeah.
And then I remember, just out of anger, I was like, if this has ever made a difference to anyone, I just wish that I would know. And then I got invited to a Toastmasters meeting as a guest. And in the meeting, this lady shared this beautiful speech about how she went through a divorce and it was like so hard and she didn't think she'd get through. And then she heard my podcast, and the person who was sharing their story touched her, and she ended up like being okay and having this great life. And that was why she invited me, was to hear. And it was titled like The Difference One Person Can Make. And that to me was like what makes it worth it. I think all of us have that like one person,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. All right. To stand out in the crowded podcasting landscape, because like I have millions of podcasts out there, what advice do you have for new podcasters based on our experience?
I can share if you like, based on what I've observed in 10 years of being in this like world podcast group.
Yeah.
If you like, the people that seem to do well, they have like consistency, which really helps with algorithm. So they post like once a week consistently, right? And then have like kind of a defined niche, like Sidney, it's very defined what you're doing, right? And I find the ones who do that consistently tend to have the best results.
Okay.
I would agree with Gina as far as the consistency. And I've sort of, I think we, especially in our first season, we always tried to release it in the same time every fortnight. And I think you really have to pick what you want to talk about and something that you're interested in and you enjoy, because, to be consistent, you have to be motivated and want to do it. So I think definitely pick something that you've got a really keen interest in yourself. And we certainly as much, got from our guests.
Yeah.
My recommendation is simple, and that's just do it. If you think about it too much, you're probably not going to do it. I find that, I'm on a long drive and I'm listening to a true crime podcast, and there's some kind of formulaic device built into it that just drags these episodes out so long and it makes it so terrible. And at the end of it, I finally find out what happened 7 or 8 hours later. And then I ask myself, could this have been a half an hour podcast? Like, did I actually need to hear all this repetitive nonsense that drags out the story endlessly? And that's what I think about when I'm recording the podcast with somebody. How do we get to what this is actually about? How do we even figure out what the guest wants to talk about in order to have something that's authentic and interesting and really like connects what we're trying to talk about, maybe or maybe not, with some interesting story about the overall topic? So, as far as getting started, I never thought I would do a podcast. It is super time intensive and complicated and comes with a million different things I couldn't have imagined when I started. But really, the only way to do it is actually do it. Whether it's good or bad, just do it. And the more that you do it, the better it's going to get with time. And then one day you'll have 130 episodes to look back on, and it's all going to be fantastic. So my recommendation is start.
I really agree with you there, Sidney, because it's like absolutely anything you ever do. You're not going to be that great the first few, but you can only improve by starting. So, you've just got to get over yourself and just give it a go.
Yeah, true. All right. What's next for you and your podcast?
So we finished season 1 and we're recording season 2. My plan is to record the entire season 2 before we release it, and we're probably going to start again in the fall. We'll do that every 2 weeks. We'll schedule it on a regular basis, and then we'll set up all the posts in advance, and then they'll just feed out over the fall semester. So because most of the academics that I talk to, that works with their work schedule, and they're not working during the summer, this works out well with the people who listen to the podcast, since most are coming from the academic world. So we'll start like maybe from September to maybe November or December.
Cool.
So on our podcast, we had season 1, which was when we interviewed and shared our stories, shared those stories of courage and resilience. So that was interviews with individuals. And then this season 2, we're still keeping the theme of courage and resilience, but we're getting more sort of experts in their field to talk about tools and strategies to help build our listeners' courage and resilience. So, for example, we had a professor from the University of Western Australia. He's the founder of a health promotion campaign called Act, Belong, Commit. So he talked about how that campaign came about. And that was a very interesting story in itself. And then he talked about what does Act, Belong, Commit mean, and how can that improve your life. So the listeners have some takeaways that they can do to improve their mental health and their health.
My research is in the ethics proposal right now. And so that's what we're proposing, is to interview people on podcasts to share their stories and to turn that into a thesis for a master's program.
That's cool.
Oh, I'd just like to add that, yes, I did listen to some podcasts of our other 2 guests and greatly enjoyed it. So it's been a great opportunity to listen to different podcasts, and well done to Sidney and Gina, and you also, David, for your great podcast.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your podcast journey. Wishing you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.